Where in your life do you need to receive in order to go forward and accomplish the things that you wish to accomplish? Tomorrow on August 6th, Mars will enter the sign of Libra. Libra is traditionally a fall sign for Mars. So in other words, Mars is not doing well in this sign. Mars is extremely struggled and extremely debilitated in this sign because Mars just wants to push forward with drive and energy, but Libra, being ruled by Venus, wants to receive. And so there's a conflation of drive and action versus reception and waiting. Now, before we get going and dive more into Mars and Libra, I'm Michael the Hierophant. I'm a practicing mystic and magi, and I encourage you to join me every single Wednesday at 6:30 Pacific, 8:30 Central, 9:30 Eastern for my weekly Zoom astrological and divination workshop, Consciousness Conjunctions and Conversations. We get together and we talk about the last week's transits, how they manifested in our lives, both anecdotally and as a community, and then weave the threads together to see how common elements show up in each other's charts despite being different types of people, different types of zodiacal signs. We also look at the next week's transits, and I teach you how to look for the energy in your life, where it's likely to show up and manifest, and what part of the spiritual story that transit might be impacting you personally in your chart. Probably one of the biggest takeaways I think that I offer my students is teaching you how to find and place yourself in the greater cosmic narrative. We are constantly pulling threads, pulling strings that lead us down different paths in life. And while we might have a fixed destiny in mind or a fixed destiny that the cosmos has set out for us, how we get there is always up to us. And since we're navigating in the dark in some woods that we've never been in before, this thing called life, I like to tell my students that there's no better compass than the stars above for getting us to where we'd like to be and where we want to go. Now, let's dive back into Mars and Libra. So Mars is associated with the planet of war, aggression. It's toxic masculinity at its finest. It's let's fight because we can fight about it. And so whenever Mars is transiting, those kinds of themes and energies tend to show up, obviously, depending on what throne room Mars is in. So tomorrow, August 6th, through September 22nd, Mars will be in the throne of Venus. Libra is the masculine Venetian sign, and it's an air sign, so we need to think intellectually. Libra is going to be very dominantly intellectual, and so that means the Martian drive that we experience will be forced through an intellectual perspective. It won't be just about getting things right like it was in Virgo. It won't be just getting the job done like it was in Leo. It's going to say, wait, hold on, let's think about this before we take action. So I've heard the comparison a lot of times that when Mars enters Libra, it's essentially like Mars as the warrior is setting down his sword and instead picking up scales. Now, Mars's motivation remains the same in Libra. Mars wants to get shit done, accomplish things, and obviously depending on where Mars is in your natal chart, that'll be more or less the story that's happening. But when it's in Libra, Mars begs us to ask the question, are we moving forward with our drive and motivation in a way that is mutually beneficial for all parties involved? Libra is obviously oftentimes associated symbolically with the scales, and with it being a male Venetian sign, it's essentially like thinking to yourself and allowing yourself to contemplate what's the benefit for them, what's the benefit for me, what's the negative for them, what's the negative for me. So when Mars is in this sign, it's not just like go fight and win the day and whatever the outcome is whatever the outcome is. There's a contradiction between the masculine Martian energy of Mars and the Venetian Libran energy. And this goes back to other videos I've talked about where Mars is, again, the masculine archetype and Venus is the feminine archetype. And when we boil those archetypes down to basic energies, we have Mars, which is a giver, an action taker. And again, action taking is giving energy into the universe. And then there's Venus, who is more patient and is the receiving energy and is more of the feminine archetype. And so in this sign, Mars is in a divine feminine sign, even if it's a masculine rendition of that feminine energy, you know, Libra being the masculine Venetian sign. And so when Mars is in this energy, there is a caution, and not necessarily at Mars's behest, but it's more of a caution of how does everybody win in this situation? And so when Mars is transiting Libra, we're much more often to find that situations within the way that we receive pleasure, or the situations that we, like conversations or even intellectualizations of how we achieve something that brings us pleasure, is kind of stunted. And it's not stunted insofar as that we can't move forward. It's stunted that we're not acting so impulsively often when Mars is in Libra. Now, again, Mars is in its fall in Libra, which means it's not working well. It's disabling the things that kind of give Mars its normal angular drive. But again, if you've experienced a lot of harsh Mars transits, sometimes Mars going through Libra isn't the worst thing. We can look to see that we'll be a lot more action driven to negotiate, to middleman, to liaison between situations, whether those are situations with family, relationships, business relationships. And it's going to give us an ability to negotiate. So think about Mars in Libra as being more symbolic of the hyper-aggressive statesman. And what I mean by that is a statesman doesn't come into a room with a rival or enemy nation and say, okay, more often than not, they don't come in and they're not like, well, we're going to just burn down your city and break your walls down. They're going to come in and they're going to say, okay, what is this going to take to bring this conflict to an end? And obviously, if there gets to a point where the conflict can't be resolved, then war continues. But for sake of this analogy, Mars in Libra is the statesman that comes in very persuasively and says, okay, we can burn your walls down, we can burn your farms, we can reduce your city to rubble. Let's not do that. I'm gonna lose a lot of good soldiers on my end, you're gonna lose a lot of good soldiers on your end. So where can we come between? What's going to make this Mars transit really interesting is that we have a really loose kite that's actually forming on August 9th, just preceding the full moon in Aquarius, and Mars in Libra will actually be opposing the Saturn-Neptune retrograde as the direct dichotomy that's defining the energy of this kite. And I'm going to do a video about that later this week. If we want to go back in time and get a thematic analysis of what this Mars in Libra will mean for you, I encourage you to look back to August 2nd. The moon sextiled Mars right as it was in its final degrees of Virgo. And the moon was in Scorpio. So there was this essentially an emotional body sensation of needing to transform something in the Virgoan areas of our chart that's obviously going to lead into the Libran storyline. And as Mars aspects further planets, including the moon, but as Mars aspects further planets throughout this Libran cycle till September 22nd, we're going to see that Martian storyline that we experienced in Virgo continuing to play out. So if you want to do some longer historical backtracking, you can go back about 2 weeks to the Mars squaring Venus and look at the energies that came up. Because again, that Mars squaring Venus was all about showing us the disharmony of where our masculine Martian giving energy was out of whack with our Venetian receiving energy. Where were we trying to receive and where were we not taking enough action in order to receive? And now that Mars is in Venus's sign of Libra, we're really going to be continuing to extrapolate whatever the discrepancy was between the divine feminine receiving and the divine masculine action taking and momentum. We're really going to be continuing to explore and expand that disharmony between those two. And Mars is going to attempt to rectify whatever that disbalance was. And obviously that's going to be the Martian storyline until you reach your Mars return. And obviously this is going to be different for everybody. However, we're all in the cosmic collective and we are all experiencing Mars and Libra at the same time. If you enjoy these spiritual narratives, I encourage you to check out the link in my bio and sign up for my class that I mentioned earlier in this video, Consciousness, Conjunctions, and Conversations. It's an evergreen link, so if the date doesn't reflect the current week, you're still signing up for the current class. It's every Wednesday at 6:30 Pacific time, and I really love what we do there. We spend a lot of time looking at birth charts. We look at the cosmic narrative that's happening collectively and in our personal lives. We see how this manifests, and we also see some of these harder to delineate transits like the Saturn-Neptune conjunction and retrograde, things that are really long-term, Uranus and Gemini. We see things that are really long-term and we see how they begin to materialize in each other's lives. And it's always really interesting when you have people that have the same rising sign that come in with transits and we see how they oppose. So for example, I have two regular students who are both Libra risings. And so this will be a fun one to go through with them, with Mars going through their first house. But I have two students who are Libra risings who have different sun signs, and the way these transits manifest, they always tend to manifest completely polar opposite of each other. And I always just find that completely fascinating to see these personal real-life case studies of how these things, materialize in our world. So if I don't see you in class, I will see you on the next video. And we are going to talk definitely a lot more about this Mars opposition to Saturn and Neptune this week, as well as the full moon in Aquarius, so stay tuned.